In one single day, the ground tore open on three different continents with five different earthquakes. It hit in unconnected places, California, Japan, and Venezuela, and which got hit with two giant ones. The second one bigger than the first. So now a lot of people are asking us questions like, why is this happening? And what if some of these were not natural? So we have here Stefan Burns, a geophysicist who has spent years out in the field using equipment to record earthquakes and map what's happening deep under our feet. He ran a Science Channel show that dug into our planet's biggest underground mysteries. And today he's talking to hundreds of thousands of people about the sun, the earth, and why the ground shakes. I have a list of questions here, but I think Stefan's here to help us think through what could be going on, tell us how to keep the people we love safe. I'm Neal K. Shah, a Johns Hopkins NIH-funded caregiving researcher, and I cover the topics that matter to older adults and family caregivers. And this topic of earthquakes and protecting our loved ones has been top of mind for many of our viewers, so we're hosting this special episode. Stefan, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
Awesome, great. So yeah, I'll kick into it. So 5 big earthquakes in one day on 3 continents, plus 1,000 smaller tremors. Is this as strange as it sounds? And does this happen more than we may realize?
Well, it is unusual. It has happened before, not in this specific variation, but it's definitely notable this time because of that earthquake doublet in Venezuela. So the 1,000 earthquakes, there's always earthquakes rumbling at different magnitudes. And in general, if it's under a magnitude 5, it can be useful for diagnosing the fault and the stress. But in terms of real impact to people, if it's under magnitude 5, it's not really doing much. Now, the first one that occurred was the 5.6 in California, and that was in between Willits and Ukiah, way up in Northern California. And you think, okay, 5.6, no big deal. Well, if you look at the record, that area has never had an earthquake that big with our modern observations in, for 200 plus years. It's never had an earthquake that big. And it's a key point for the San Andreas. So that's showing that there is this progression that's evolving and unfolding with the San Andreas, and we don't know when that's going to have the next big rupture, but it's clearly important.
Wow.
Then you have the magnitude 6.9 that hit Japan according to the USGS, 7.2 according to the Japanese.
Wow.
That's just the latest in a flurry of earthquakes over the past 8 months there. Thankfully not too destructive because they have well-designed buildings. It's off the coast, further away from Tokyo to the north. But then it was the doublet in Venezuela. That was a big deal. That's the really destructive one.
Yeah, and let's talk about that, what happened in Venezuela. With the doublet, the 2 quakes 40 seconds apart, and the second one being bigger, people are saying that almost never happens. And I think what many people are kind of wondering is that it struck near the oil region just after we've had a big geopolitical shift, over the last year in who might control that oil. So when you study all this, and studying earthquakes for a living, when you look at all that together, what is the science telling you? Is the timing meaningful? Is it a coincidence? Could there be potential like man-made events behind this?
And just to finish answering the question too, is that we do get these clustering of earthquakes that occur, and then sometimes things are calm and quiet for a few weeks, a few months, and then we get this clustering to occur. So that's not necessarily unusual, though it may be like 3-4 months until we get this, what I call a global seismic burst. But Venezuela is so weird because that 40-second separation, and then the synchronicity of how there's been all this geopolitical turmoil there is very interesting. And as someone that tracks this, and I just basically I'm pattern recognition machine. I've noticed that earthquakes pop off in areas more frequently. Don't ask me to explain how. But if you track it, notable earthquakes pop off in areas more frequently that are they're like these geopolitical pinch points. So I don't really know how to explain that. It's unusual. A good example is that right when Trump and Putin had talks in 2025 in Alaska, we had a flurry of earthquakes in Alaska and Russia. So it's something about what humans are doing and what the Earth is doing that there's like a shared resonance, like a deeper level of reality. Again, I don't know how to explain it, but we see it over and over. And so there has been a change now in who, I guess, controls those oil fields. And there is a connection with fracking, for example, and earthquakes. We see that abundantly across the world, especially in the United States and Texas, but these generally don't get that big.
Yeah, yeah, and actually that was going to be my next question. That I read up a little bit on the Stanford study showing the connection between fracking, and I think they were saying it was proven in Oklahoma. Like what is the mechanism of that, and do you think there may be something like that going on here in Venezuela?
Probably not in Venezuela, because this is a well-known major plate boundary strike slip, and it has all the characteristics of that having been related to just the overall accumulation of strain between South America and the Caribbean plate.
Yeah.
But I'm not going to say it had zero impact. Like I don't know, but it basically follows the track record perfectly. As it relates to fracking, they're going down and drilling, then they even go horizontal now, and they inject this briny salt water and sand to create these fractures, and the sand helps it hold those cracks open. These are in rock layers that are kind of brittle, and so that fracturing process just in general weakens these geologic layers that are 2, 3, 4, 5 kilometers down. If the natural gas seeps out, it's a pretty short-lived process. It's not abundant like these oil reservoirs. That's a little different. That's more so what Venezuela has. But that just weakens the layer overall. And now if you have a highly fractured geologic rock layer that's not really ductile, it's more brittle over a large area, you're going to start having microseismicity, and you can even start to get up to magnitude 5 earthquakes that are very likely caused by the abundant fracking area. We see those in Oklahoma, Texas. The magnitude 5 level is pretty rare, but the magnitude 1, 2, 3, and even 4 level is becoming increasingly more common.
Wow.
And so then I just think, just going one step further, over a very large area, that could perhaps be activating ancient fault lines, or even creating perhaps new ones that could maybe generate something bigger. Like it's possible. I wouldn't be someone to say we know everything and that's not possible.
Yeah. That's super interesting. That's super, thanks for clarifying. And I think another thing a lot of people have been bringing up, at least in our comments, has been HAARP, HAARP, this antenna field up in Alaska. And I guess in plain English, like, how would you explain kind of what does that do? And could things like that, weather modification programs have any impact on, what happens with, with earthquakes?
Yeah, that's a interesting rabbit hole that I've explored, and with an open mind too.
Yeah.
Because the traditional mindset or just mainstream thing is like, oh, there's no impact. But in fact, there is a lot of impact of these ionospheric heaters, as they're called, on the planet. Okay. So I'll get to that. But right out of the gate, I don't think these things are necessarily earthquake machines, unless there's like some hidden secret technology much more powerful than the ionospheric heaters that we know about that are in operation. But the one that has the name that everyone knows is the one up in Alaska. But in fact, we have one in Norway, you have one in Russia, you have some other installations. And what they do is, are these large antenna fields. Instead of just one antenna, it's actually a whole bunch of these megahertz frequency antennas, and they blast that energy just like a cell tower.
Yeah.
Right. They blast it up, or even the Wi-Fi from your computer, up to the ionosphere, which is the upper part of Earth's atmosphere, where you have a little bit of plasma, the fourth state of matter. So you have an electron stripped off of the molecule or whatever. And so as a result, it's a lot more susceptible to the influence of electromagnetic fields.
Yeah. And
so you have powerful electric currents. Earth's magnetic field there is now starting to connect into the space environment, the plastosphere. And beyond the ionosphere, you have just plasma, but it's very low density. These are the radiation belts, and there's other populations as well. So what happens is every ion, or this plasma that's in this space, has a certain resonance to it. It's called ion cyclotron resonance. And it's based upon the magnetic field strength, and it's based upon what the ion is, whether it's an electron, a proton, or maybe it's like some heavier ion. Yeah. Like oxygen, like an ionized oxygen atom. And so it has this spin to it. And HAARP will go in with this megahertz energy, and it induces ionospheric precipitation. because it's able to effectively kind of like connect to these ions that are just kind of oscillating and jiggling up there, and then cause them to precipitate down.
Yeah.
So we were actually doing these sort of these experiments, you could call them, with the advent of the power grids, because you have something known as power line harmonic resonance, which is 50, 60 hertz energy from these extensive power grids across the globe. They're so powerful that that energy actually gets out to space. It's not megahertz energy anymore,
Wow.
but it also interacts at the ion cyclotron resonant frequency and causes precipitation. So we first discovered the radiation belts, like, I think the 60s basically. It's like 50s, 60s with Van Allen. They sent probes up there and they were like, oh, we didn't even know these existed. They do. We never measured the radiation belts in situ before they were being perturbed by anthropogenic activity. Because the power grids predated them. So the level of significance of that, I don't know, but we know that they're quite strong. And there's really good research on power line harmonic resonance, PLHR.
Yeah.
So it was already a perturbed system. And now you have these researchers who think it's a good idea to basically beam microwaves up there. And they can, by the way they pulse them, they can induce frequency shifts. They've done research in inducing what are known as Schumann resonant frequencies. This is Earth's natural resonant frequency that overlaps profoundly with our biology. As someone who's into health, wellness, and all that, that's a really interesting place to look, because we evolved in these energy fields. So this is like 7.8 hertz, 14 hertz, 20 hertz. Either way, they can start to now measurably shift the Schumann resonance using these ionospheric heaters. And when you get ion precipitation, you create this hole in the ionosphere, and then these waves go up and they cause the ions in the plastosphere to precipitate down. And now you're actually changing the properties of the ionosphere to an even greater degree. And we see that that's connected. Just the ionosphere in general, this layer of plasma at the top of the Earth in general, is connected to not only like our weather, so this can be severe weather, tornadoes, things of that nature, but it's also very profoundly connected to our Earth geophysical system and earthquakes. Because we see with earthquakes, we saw with this earthquake that just hit China a couple days ago, 5.2, mainland, inland, we saw earthquake lights pop up from that. That's a basically a little ball of plasma shooting up from the fault line.
Wow.
And it goes straight up because of its energy. It's an interesting conversation, but plasma likes to stay up in the ionosphere, the plastosphere. That's why it's there.
Yeah.
And so we see what are known as total electron content changes to the ionosphere, sometimes before, during, or shortly after earthquakes. We've measured changes in the Schumann resonances as pre-earthquake signals many times before in history. There's also been longer-term changes that preceded big earthquakes. For example, 1960 and 1964, that's Chile, magnitude 9.5, magnitude 9.2, Alaska. We even noticed these gamma waves in Earth's magnetic field itself that lasted for many hours afterwards. There are very low frequency changes, but I mean, you can measure these out sometimes months in advance with the right receiving technology. So it's a super interconnected system is the point that I'm getting to. If a lot of that flew over your head, it's a super interconnected system.
Yeah, that is. And I think adding another interconnection into the system, let's talk about the sun a little bit. So I actually am particularly very interested in this topic because I live in North Carolina, and, a couple of years ago, there was a massive hurricane here, Hurricane Helene, and ended up doing a bunch of research and writing an article about how sun's activity seems to track with hurricane patterns going back over 250 years. And I found a lot of research papers. And then now I was curious to find your ideas around the sun's impact on potentially even things like earthquakes. I guess how far does the reach of the sun and solar activity go as to weather pattern and, frankly, even seismic activity on Earth? And could there be some sort of cause and effect or correlation to what's happening deep in the ground?
Yeah, so with Venezuela and this Japan earthquake less than 30 minutes after, we had a direct connection to what's known as a high-speed stream of solar wind. And this is why I'm not looking at HAARP really seriously in this regard, though, again, there is funny business there.
Yeah.
And if there is more advanced technology, then I'm not one to say, oh, it's impossible to influence earthquake patterns. But I think people, if they sometimes see these earthquake lights, or there's also now AI videos going out, fake stuff, but then they jump to these other conclusions. But again, I'm not one to say, oh, it's not possible. We know that there's weather manipulation that's occurring, cloud seeding, and the question is, in my mind, we know they're doing it, but are they going beyond what's being disclosed to the public? And I would think probably yes.
Yeah.
So how significant is that then?
Yeah.
So, but with this case, and with most of the main earthquakes that we see in general, you know, earthquakes are driven by strain accumulation on a fault at a plate boundary. So that's the plate tectonic cycle. And there's things that can load energy into faults in addition to the movement of plates. For example, big earthquake in Venezuela is going to put some energy into faults in Colombia. And in 1967, when we had a magnitude 6.7 strike in Venezuela, right near Caracas, we also had a 6.7 in Colombia the same day. Wow. So you can see how there's these connections there. So that's one way energy can get loaded to a fault. There's these natural geologic processes that build strain on fault. But there are trigger mechanisms that can be from the earth, but also external, like tidal forces. Yeah. And that's pretty well proven, but with another 40 years of data, we'll really see that connection, because the tidal rhythm will have multiple cycles of data now for that. Yeah. Our high resolution seismic catalogs really only go back to like 1980, like super high res, where you can see these connections. So that's the thing. For you to say you don't even have, to say that there's zero connection between the sun and earthquakes or the moon and earthquakes, when we don't even have 100 years of data. Yeah. And these are geologic cycles of time that we're discussing. It's like, it's a pretty ignorant statement, in my opinion, to make. Yeah. And some of these statements that now are more mainstream thoughts, because it was put out by like the USGS or something, they were written like 2005. So we almost had no data. Now we at least have another 20 years, and now it's really starting to get proven. And there's these longer rhythms of solar activity that are like 100 years in length. So you kind of need to get ideally at least one of those, because there's probably variations across that longer cycle. The regular solar cycle is 11 years in length. You have maximum activity, you have minimum activity, but you can have a solar flare on the sun, and the light photons, extreme ultraviolet, X-ray, very high vibe. When that hits the Earth 8.3 minutes later, it will ionize that ionosphere with more plasma, going from 1% to some higher percentage. Okay. So that can be a very quick effect, affecting the electron content of the ionosphere. We see that there's these connections between that and earthquakes. Yeah. We have, if that solar flare, for example, launched out a solar storm, that solar storm hitting us can then influence the Earth in quite significant ways. They found that when there's a big solar storm impact and we have a geomagnetic storm, it's about a month afterwards that there's an increased chance of high magnitude quakes. So there can also be delay periods to this as it relates. And then there's these coronal holes that emit these high-speed streams. We had one of those impact right as this Venezuela quake, the quakes, and Japan and California all popped off. So, and that's the thing that's most well linked, based on my research, to high magnitude earthquakes. Because if you can read it, basically, if you look at the earthquake record and the high magnitude quakes, they stand out, and they have this this solar periodicity of about 28 days. Yeah. Because these coronal holes can last multiple rotations, and this solar cycle 25, has been unusual in the fact that we've had so many of these coronal holes as compared to prior solar cycles. Yeah. So normally we don't get this many. This time we have, and we had a magnitude 8.8 megaquake last year. We had a 7.7 that hit Burma and Myanmar that was super destructive and lives lost. We've had multiple magnitude 7s strike Japan. we had multiple magnitude 7s strike the opposite point of Kamchatka, Russia, south of South America.
Yeah.
Think about how that loaded energy going up into the continent. Right now, we're seeing Venezuela respond less than a year later.
Yeah.
Philippines, Indonesia, we have Vanuatu, Tonga, like a lot of places have been very active.
Yeah.
But Turkey going back to 2023, that was very similar to Venezuela. So we see these doublets every now and then, but they are pretty rare. This one in Venezuela being very odd that there was only 40 seconds.
Yeah.
The one in Turkey was 10 hours in between, but they do happen. But the fact that we had this coronal hole high-speed stream connect to Earth right, like literally like 20 minutes, the solar wind spiked up before the earthquake is such clear proof. That they're connected.
Yeah. Wow. That's super interesting. That's super interesting. And then speaking of like other interesting things, I think, people have been pointing out the Earth's magnetic field is getting weaker, and saying even auroras are showing up as far south as Florida. I guess what's happening there? Is our planet's shield weakening, and could that have any, impact on, susceptibility to quakes?
Yeah. So Earth's magnetic field is weakening. There are two main changes that are unfolding. You have a large magnetic anomaly centered over South America.
Okay.
So kind of interesting. In this context, kind of interesting.
Yeah.
But that is centered really over like the real center of it's over Rio de Janeiro, but it's pretty wide. And it's actually extending out into the Atlantic to the east.
Okay.
And that's where Earth's magnetic field is the weakest.
Okay.
So the average field strength, let's say, is like 50,000 nanotesla, 45, 55. There, it's about 23,000 nanotesla. Wow. In the strongest regions in Siberia, it's around 60, or sorry, actually, Antarctica will be where it's strongest. That's 67,000 nanotesla. Okay. It is still quite strong in Siberia, around 62,000 nanotesla. Yeah. So you have this kink in the armor that's getting bigger and also degrading more and more, yearly. We can measure that. You also have normally our history, our observation is that there were two strong spots in the northern hemisphere. We call them flux lobes. Okay. So think of like two extra shields there. The Canadian one has been weakening, and the Siberian one has been strengthening. So the magnetic pole in the northern hemisphere, which is actually where the field lines flow in, so technically it's a south pole, or in other words, it's a negative polarity. The field lines are coming in, they're coming out in Antarctica in the southern hemisphere. I see. But that is shifting. We think it's shifting because of the two flux lobes changing, and that makes a lot of sense. I'm pretty sure that's what it is. So it's shifting at the same time as you have Canada weakening, the South Atlantic anomaly weakening, and then in general the field is weakening, though it is actually getting stronger in Siberia. Okay. So it's not a complete homogeneous thing. Okay. Now, to put this in context, we've seen this movement of the magnetic pole in the northern hemisphere quickly through the Arctic before. We have data going back to 200 AD that shows it circling through and at the same velocity at times in the same area. So it seems to be a regular pulse rate rhythm, almost like a heartbeat. Okay. And the magnetic field is actually still quite strong historically. So it is weaker than it was in 1000 AD, and it is weaker than it was in 1000 BC, but it is still quite strong historically. So there are some people that are taking an extra step in saying the fact that it's weakening and that the magnetic pole in the northern hemisphere is moving is indicating that we're in a pole reversal where the magnetic field flips. That's a pretty rare thing to occur. We have excursions where it may almost flip, but then it goes back. The last big one, there's been others, but the last big one was about 42,000 years ago, the Shah excursion. Wow. We're not at a point where we can definitively say we're in an excursion, and you can't say we're in a reversal until an excursion actually cements itself in place. Yeah. Because the Shah went all the way, and then it reverted back 1,000 years later, effectively. Yeah. So it's just simply you're not following the data if you're saying that we're in a reversal. We could be, but it's too early to tell. It's like the first inning, if that is the case, of 9. But I personally don't think we are. I think we're seeing normal secular variations, but the field is weakening. And you do have that movement. So again, the field in the northern hemisphere flows inwards. So think about how that energy from the space weather environment, right? These solar storms, these particles now are flowing not into the area over Canada, but actually over now a spreading center called Gokul Ridge. There's an old supervolcano there. Soon they'll be flowing into Siberia, where you had lots of extensive volcanism in the past. So it's, you know, it's a whole complex, nuanced thing that we don't know everything about. But and then the aurora, that's a little bit of a different story too. But I'm not necessarily concerned or worried about these things. But it is, you know, we live on a living, breathing planet, and these are changes that are unfolding, and so it's really good to study them so we can understand, because then there are real world implications like these earthquakes, 60,000 missing now. And they are all connected together in some way.
Now, I think, and then talking about practical real world implications, you know, I guess, what are your thoughts, you know, in terms of, there's a lot of online debates now of like, what should you do if you're in one? And that's like one of our biggest questions, right? That we help a lot of caregivers and people who are caring for older adults. You know, a lot of survivors are swearing that the only people who made it in Venezuela were people who ran outside. But then sometimes the official advice is the opposite of like, stay where you are, get under a table, don't move locations, stay put. You know, so who do you think is right, and what's like the advice if you know, feel like it's going to happen around you?
It depends on where you are. I mean, certainly the people in these buildings, the ones that got out are the ones that survived, because I mean, you can see some of the videos where it collapses in literally the span of like 5 seconds. You see each layer buckle under the other. There's no way. Well, I mean, there are people that somehow survived that, but now they're trapped under rubble, and the rescue efforts right now are very subpar, unfortunately. So I mean, if you're in, I personally would be looking to get outside. I'd be looking to get outside if possible. If you have an early warning app, that may give you 5-10 seconds, hopefully a little bit more. But if it is more, you're going to be further away from the epicenter, and you're probably not going to have as much of a problem. But any advantage that you can give yourself is going to be good. Here's one interesting thing to think about, is that the P wave is the fastest wave. This is the compressional wave. So this is what gives people that early warning. And if you have a big enough earthquake, that P wave will be a jolt that you may feel, or your dog, or you know, animals, pets. They may feel that and start making noise and getting agitated. You don't know with that P wave, if it's strong, whether that's the actual main earthquake, let's say magnitude 5 nearby, or the P wave for something giant. So it can be kind of difficult to tell. So last year, there was an earthquake in San Diego, where I am, and you know, that jolt hit. It was actually the main body of seismic waves from the magnitude 5.2. I didn't know that. And California can have big earthquakes, so I ran outside, and then nothing else happened. Thank God. But I mean, if you can't get outside, I guess that's the thing. If it's like literally not possible to get outside, then you're going to want to take shelter somehow. And I mean, just with this Venezuela situation, sometimes you just can't. I think sometimes you just can't win, unfortunately. But it is important to, like, sometimes the official advice isn't necessarily the best advice. Like, just an anecdotal story I can tell. My friend who was in a very large earthquake and tsunami in Hawaii in 1975, they were on the beach, and there was another guy that was on the beach too, and he knew that tsunami was coming in, so he started running up the hill. He actually was one of the people that didn't survive because the tsunami wave caught him and then pushed him straight down to a gully, and he drowned. So he was doing the right thing, but it didn't necessarily work out for him. So it's difficult to know exactly what's going to happen, because it's just, these things are just so chaotic. But get outside if you can, away from tall buildings, objects, trees, etc. That's by far the best thing that you can do. No, thanks. That's
very, very good, helpful, practical advice. You know, and then I guess to finish it off, you know, kind of rapid surprise question. What's the scariest thing that the sun has done that most people have no idea about?
That's a good question. I'm glad you asked that. Because this is something that we've never experienced in our modern era.
Mm-hmm.
And now we have 10,000 plus Starlinks in space. We have, of course, all the other satellites, right? It's only taken a few years for all these Starlinks to go up. They're building tons of infrastructure in space now. Of course, we have our power grids and everything else. We have evidence of what are known as Miyake events. And basically, a Japanese researcher, her last name is Miyake, she was looking at trees and measuring the radioisotope values in different tree rings. And now many other people have done this around the world. And she found signatures of this massive increase in carbon radioisotope, also beryllium, a few others, but really primarily carbon, showing that there was some energetic event that occurred. And based off of the level of increase and what we know about the carbon-12, the carbon-14 ratio, we can kind of calculate the overall energy of a Miyake event. And it's 10 to 100 times stronger than the Carrington event. And if you don't know the Carrington event, this is 1859, it was the largest solar flare ever observed on record.
Wow.
And also the largest solar storm. So it hit super fast, had the right connection to our magnetic field. Aurora were driven down all the way to the equator, right? Like people were freaking out. We've had other things like this across time, but we actually started to have some magnetometers around the globe in 1859 versus year 200, let's say. So we've had Miyake events in 774 to 775 AD. It's hard to get the exact year. 993 AD, 1052. There's other candidates. There's also ones going way further back, but 10 to 100 times stronger. Now, during the Carrington event, you had telegraph operators, like there were lines that were like sparks were flying off of telegraph wires, and some of the operators even pulled the connection from the batteries, and it was still working because of these geomagnetically induced currents. You know, these electric currents flowing in the ionosphere can induce electric currents within anything that's a conductor, especially a long conductor, because there's a resonance that occurs. So nowadays, if we had a Carrington event, it would be a big deal, like a really big deal, because we have all this modern technology that we can rely on. Planes are flying overhead, satellites, you know, during a solar storm, you even have the atmosphere expand out and you have increased drag on satellites. So you can cause them to start basically raining down and burning up in the mesosphere. It could get really wild. A Miyake event is significantly stronger than a Carrington event. And that would probably just set us back like to the Stone Age. Like we really don't know. We don't exactly know what caused them. We think it's from the sun. We don't know if it's just a particle precipitation event. You get these particle storms where sometimes it's just high energy particles, but there's no solar storm that hits. Because they travel at different speeds. Particles can travel near the speed of light. A solar storm can travel as fast as maybe 2,000 kilometers per second, which will take... You could get a solar storm to launch from the sun and hit Earth in about 14 hours. That's fastest, from what we know. But a particle event can occur within like 30 minutes or less. So it can be very, very fast because they're relativistic. They're traveling near the speed of light. So we don't know if the Miyake event is from just a particle event or from a particle event and a huge solar storm impact, because the biggest solar storms will necessarily have a particle event as well, these particle storms. That's a little bit of uncertainty. You could also feasibly have a Miyake event from like a supernova beam impact, but the chance of that, is super low. It gets wild, but that is what most people are completely unaware of. And you could have just 30 minutes before it happens. So we don't know.
That's fascinating. Thanks for sharing. And I think, given the dependence of modern communication and just modern life on so much electronic technology, like you mentioned, planes, travel, satellites, even cell phone networks and stuff. It's kind of like interesting and scary to think about.
And the final thing is, just because we see this connection between the sun, and also one of the other things that's very well shown is these particle storms are correlated very nicely to high magnitude earthquakes. So if you get this sort of particle storm to hit, or whatever a Miyake event is, or even a Carrington event, what happens then with earthquake activity? Does it just suddenly wake up a bunch of faults? Like For a Miyake event, I think that's probably what happens. But
Yeah.
that now you start to, we don't know. We
Yeah.
won't know until it happens. And we hope it doesn't happen anytime soon, but
Yeah.
it could happen really any time in the future.
Yeah. No, I mean, this is fascinating. Stefan, thanks so much, for taking the time. I mean, I think you took something that, genuinely mystifies and scares people. And I think, you're helping it make sense of it all, so I think that's really helpful for people. I think a lot of folks will, find this conversation to be fascinating. Maybe they'll go out and do more research. And I think hopefully they'll be able to feel more prepared, to protect themselves and their loved ones. I guess if you could tell everyone, where can they follow your work and watch for more updates, on, these phenomena, learn more about the sun and the earth, and, how can they keep learning?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I track all this stuff, release video updates almost daily on my channel on YouTube. This is at Stefan Burns, so StefanBurns. I also post updates in between my videos on X, so Twitter X, that's at Stefan Burns Geo. Those are my two main places. I also have a website, earthevolution.com. And really, I just have a deep curiosity about this. And I also now kind of feel a sense of responsibility because there's still resistance in just the overall mainstream whatever to, for some reason, this connection between the giant star that powers everything and loads the earth with all the energy for everything and the natural geophysical processes. So I feel this kind of responsibility to educate people on this and move the needle because it could save lives. And I was talking about 2 weeks before Venezuela about how South America was next in line for a big earthquake. And I didn't know exactly where, but I had a sense that South America was next, and it did happen. So there were people that were more prepared, I'm sure, because my videos get a lot of views because of that. So I just do my best to help everyone out.
No, that's awesome. Stefan, thanks so much for taking the time. And, for viewers out there, text someone that that might be living in an earthquake zone, ask them to, check out Stefan's work and, share this video and just help people make a plan, so that's it. We'll be sharing clips from this conversation over the next week and across social media. Stefan, thank you so much for taking the time. And this was really wonderful. Really appreciate it.
Great. Thanks, Neal.
Great.